Have you ever considered the true meaning of isolation? Not the quiet solitude of an empty house, but the profound, crushing loneliness of being the only living souls on a speck of rock in the middle of a furious, unforgiving ocean. For some, this is a job. But what happens when that isolation is invaded? What happens when you are not alone after all, and the light you are meant to keep is the one thing a terrible darkness wants to extinguish? Our story takes us to the Flannan Isles, a remote and uninhabited cluster of rocks in the Outer Hebrides of Scotland, a place known to sailors as the Seven Hunters. The largest of these is Moor, the Big Isle. For centuries, it was a place of superstition, a place where shepherds would not stay the night, whispering of ancient spirits and a palpable, watching presence. In 1899, against this backdrop of folklore, a magnificent lighthouse was built, a 75-foot tower of defiant stone, a beacon of modernity in a land steeped in myth. By December of 1900, the lighthouse was manned by 3 keepers. Thomas Marshall, a seasoned veteran of the Northern Lighthouse Board, was the principal keeper, a man of steady habits and quiet authority. James Duckett was a husband and father, a man known for his calm demeanor, who endured the loneliness for the sake of his family. The third was Donald MacArthur, a tough, hot-tempered former sailor, serving as the occasional keeper. 3 men, sealed in a stone tower, their lives governed by the turning of the light and the roar of the sea. Their only link to the outside world was the relief vessel, the Hesperus, scheduled to arrive just after Christmas. But on December 15th, a passing steamer, the Archtor, noted something deeply unsettling as it passed the islands in the dead of night. The light on Moor was dark. It was a grave breach of duty, an almost unthinkable failure for men of the service. But the Archtor had its own schedule to keep, and the report was not logged until it docked on the mainland. A profound and terrible silence had already fallen over the island. A brutal storm then swept through the region, delaying the Hesperus for days. When it finally set out on Boxing Day, December 26th, its captain, Jim Harvey, was already on edge. As they approached Moor, a sense of deep wrongness permeated the air. The island was unnaturally still. The customary flag was not flying from the mast. The landing stage was empty, with no sign of the keepers preparing the supply boxes for their arrival. An oppressive, tomb-like quiet had replaced the expected signs of life. Harvey blasted the ship's horn, the sound echoing strangely off the cliffs before being swallowed by the vast, indifferent ocean. There was no reply. He fired a signal flare, a burst of red against the gray sky. Still nothing. A small boat was lowered, carrying the relief keeper, Joseph Moore. As he was rowed towards the landing stage, a knot of pure dread tightened in his stomach. The place felt dead. It felt empty in a way that went beyond mere absence. Moore climbed the steep, rock-hewn steps to the lighthouse complex, alone. The main gate was closed, as was the door to the tower, but neither was locked. He called out the names of the keepers: Marshall, Duckett, MacArthur, his voice sounding small and weak against the sighing of the wind. The only answer was the lonely cry of a gull. He pushed open the heavy main door and stepped into a world frozen in a moment of quiet, inexplicable terror. The first thing he noticed was the cold. The hearth was dark, the peat fire long dead. In the small kitchen, a half-eaten meal of salted mutton and potatoes sat on the table. A stark and lonely tableau. A single chair was overturned, as if someone had sprung from their seat in a sudden, violent haste. The large clock on the wall, a faithful servant of their rigid routine, had stopped. The hands were frozen, a silent testament to a moment when time itself had ended for the keepers of the light. Moore's dread intensified as he moved through the silent rooms. He found the keepers' beds unmade, a minor but unsettling break from their meticulous military-style discipline. Everything seemed to speak of a sudden, unplanned departure. In the entrance hall, he made the most chilling discovery of all. On the hooks by the door hung 2 sets of the heavy, oilskin waterproofs issued to the keepers. One set was missing. Only one. This single detail defied all logical explanation. The weather had been atrocious. It was unthinkable that 2 of the men would have gone out into a raging Atlantic storm. But for one of them to have gone out without his protective gear was an act of pure madness. It suggested a panic so absolute, a terror so immediate, that the simple act of putting on a coat was impossible. Moore backed out of the tower, his heart pounding, his mind reeling. The place felt haunted, not by ghosts, but by the sheer, screaming impossibility of it all. A search of the island revealed further strangeness. On the western landing, a scene of incredible violence was discovered. A supply crate, which had been secured to the rock over 100 feet above sea level, was smashed open, its contents strewn about. Iron railings that lined the path were bent and twisted out of shape. A massive block of stone, weighing over a ton, had been dislodged. The damage was immense, but it was attributed to the recent storm. Yet no storm, no matter how powerful, could explain what happened to the men. The final piece of the puzzle was the lighthouse logbook. The entries were mundane at first, noting wind speeds and routine maintenance. But then the tone shifted. On December 12th, Principal Keeper Thomas Marshall, the most experienced man on the island, had logged a report of a severe storm, the likes of which he had never witnessed. He wrote of severe winds that shook the entire tower. Strangely, there were no such storms reported in the area on that date. The weather on the surrounding sea was calm. The next entry was even more disturbing. Marshall wrote that James Duckett had been very quiet, and that the tough ex-sailor Donald MacArthur had been crying. This was utterly out of character. What could make a man like MacArthur, a man who had faced the worst the sea could throw at him, break down and weep? Marshall's entry ends with a note that the three men had been praying. The storm they were facing was clearly not one of wind and water. The last entry in the logbook was a single cryptic sentence scribbled on December 15th. Storm ended, sea calm. God is over all. And then nothing. The log was clean. The ink was dry. This was the final communication from the three keepers of the Flannan Isles light. After that date, they had simply ceased to be. They had been erased from their lonely rock by a force that left behind only questions and a deep, abiding chill. Let us now imagine what the official reports could not. Let us step back into that tower, into the growing dread of those final days. The storm Marshall wrote of was not in the sky, but in their minds, and on the island itself. It began as a sound, a low, guttural moaning carried on the wind that wasn't the wind. It was a sound that seemed to come from the ancient rock beneath them, a sound of something vast and hungry, awakening from a long slumber. At night, shadows would move at the edge of the lantern's powerful beam, flitting between the standing stones that dotted the island. MacArthur, on the night watch, saw them first, dark, man-like shapes that seemed to rise from the churning sea itself and stand on the cliffs, watching the tower with an unnerving stillness. When he told the others, they dismissed it as fatigue, as the sea madness that could sometimes afflict isolated men. But then they all began to feel it, a palpable pressure against the very stones of the lighthouse, as if a giant, unseen hand was trying to squeeze the life from it. They heard scratching at the thick iron door, a sound like stone scraping on stone. The crying Marshall reported wasn't from MacArthur's fear, but from his rage and terror combined, as he screamed at the unseen tormentors to show themselves, his voice lost in the unholy din. The entity that haunted Eilean Moor was ancient, a spirit of the deep ocean, a thing of salt and foam and drowned sailors' souls. It resented the light, this single, piercing eye of man that dared to defy the primordial darkness of its domain. For a year it had watched and waited. Now it had come to put the light out, to reclaim the island for the eternal night of the sea. The storm of December 12th was its first major assault. The men huddled inside as the tower shook, not from wind, but from a focused, malevolent energy. The wailing from outside was no longer just the wind. It was a chorus of voices, the whispering, pleading voices of every soul ever lost to the unforgiving waters around the isle. They were praying not for deliverance from a storm, but from a siege by the dead. The entity was clever. It knew their hearts, their duties. On the night of the 15th, after the unearthly storm had passed, it changed its tactics. It began to mimic the sound of a ship's horn, a desperate, frantic blast that signaled a vessel in distress, crashing on the rocks below. It was a sound no keeper could ignore. Their sacred duty was to the light, but also to the preservation of life. Thomas Marshall, the principal keeper, made the decision. He and James Duckett would go down to the western landing to investigate. It was a breach of regulations. One man must always remain with the light. But the sound was too real, too desperate. They donned their oilskins, their faces grim, and left MacArthur behind, ordering him to keep the light steady. They were walking out to answer a phantom's call. MacArthur waited, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He watched from the lantern room as his two companions disappeared down the winding steps into the darkness. He watched the sea. There was no ship. There was only the calm, black water and the mocking silence. The horn was gone. A new sound had replaced it. The terrified, choked-off screams of Marshall and Duckett. He knew. In that moment, he knew it was a trap. Rage, pure and undiluted, overwhelmed his fear. He wasn't going to die cowering in a stone tower. He grabbed a boat hook from the wall, a makeshift weapon against an impossible foe, and burst out of the main door, not even bothering with his oilskins. He ran, screaming his defiance, towards the western landing to face the thing that had taken his friends. He was the overturned chair. He was the final, desperate act of a doomed man. What happened next on that landing stage was witnessed by no living thing. The three men were confronted by the horror from the sea. Perhaps it took a form, a great, towering wave of dark water with 100 drowning faces inside it. Perhaps it remained a formless, psychic terror that simply broke their minds and stopped their hearts. They were not washed away. They were taken, pulled into the cold, dark embrace of the entity that owned the island. And so, when Joseph Moore arrived 11 days later, he found only the echoes of their final, terrifying moments. The stopped clock, marking the hour of their confrontation. The uneaten meal from a time before the phantom horn blew. The single set of oilskins, a testament to Donald MacArthur's final, futile charge into the abyss. He found a stage, but the actors and the monster were long gone. The official inquiry, conducted by the Northern Lighthouse Board, concluded that the three men had been swept away by a single, massive rogue wave while tending to the equipment on the landing. It was a neat, rational explanation for an event that defied all reason. It explained the damage. It explained their absence. But it could not explain the fear in the logbook. It could not explain the untouched meal. And it could never, ever explain why one of them had faced that wave without his coat. The mystery became a legend, a ghost story told by sailors for over a century. The Flannan Isles lighthouse was remanned, but it was never the same. Keepers who served there in the following years spoke of an unshakable feeling of sorrow and dread that permeated the tower. They would hear footsteps on the spiral staircase when they were alone. They would hear faint, mournful whispers on the wind names being called out in the night. Marshall, Duckett, MacArthur. Some claimed that on foggy nights, if you stared long enough from the lantern room, you could see 3 shadowy figures standing on the western landing, forever staring out at the sea that had claimed them. They were the island's new, eternal keepers, bound to the rock by their tragic fate, their souls fueling the very darkness they had once fought against with their light. The lighthouse on Eilean Moor is now fully automated. No human keepers are required to live within its lonely stone walls. The light still shines, a cold mechanical pulse in the vast darkness of the North Atlantic. But the island itself remains a place of deep superstition, a place that feels as if it is holding its breath, waiting. The questions left behind are as cold and as deep as the sea itself. What truly happened in those final, terrifying hours? Was it a freak wave, a moment of madness, or something far older and more malevolent? The logbook tells a story of a storm that never was, of tough men weeping, of a sudden, unnatural calm before an eternal silence. It reads not like a weather report, but like the final chapter of a horror story. Perhaps some places in this world are not meant for the light. Perhaps they are gateways, places where the veil between our world and a much older, darker one is thin. The men of the Flannan Isles light were good men doing their duty, but they were doing it on borrowed land, on a sacred, haunted rock that never wanted them there in the first place. The next time you see the distant, lonely beam of a lighthouse sweeping across a dark sea, think of the keepers, think of the isolation, and the quiet courage it takes to keep the light burning, and think of Thomas Marshall, James Duckett, and Donald MacArthur, 3 men who went to tend a light, and instead found a darkness that swallowed them whole, leaving behind only an impossible and eternal mystery.